Dear class, welcome back to International Relations. We are looking at Chapter 2, World History, essentially. Mingst and McKibben offer a lot of detail looking at the last 600 years. What was happening, typically, particularly in Europe? The development, from Roman times. Rome breaks up, we saw that in the video as well, and becomes all these different fragments which are trying to form into kingdoms. Some of them become part of mini empires. They're changing form. We saw that, in England as well. You see England is fragmented, suddenly becomes stable, and then tries to take over Ireland and other parts. In what is today France, we saw the Frankish kingdom emerge. We saw stages where after Rome, it's part of the Eastern, or rather the Western Roman Empire. We also saw the emergence of France. In Spain, we saw similar kinds of changes happening. And ultimately, we saw the emergence of republics. And Mingst and McKibben do try to explain these phenomena and other kinds of political situations. Um, One of the things that I found over the years with my students, they tell me that, I read chapter 2, it has a lot of detail, but I didn't understand. Some of the things weren't clicking. And I just couldn't retain things because it's so much information, but it didn't sort of make sense. And so this time I looked at the readings again and I saw this actually makes a lot of sense. This is actually what I felt as well as I'm reading through. So what I did here is I actually create this lecture looking at a broader bibliography and looking at certain kinds of readings which will fill in the gaps. The book offers some explanations. I'm not particularly happy with them. However, you should read chapter 2 back to back. And for this week, read half of that. And the next week, read the second half. So let's look at the political changes in Europe that they talk about. The key developments, some of them are the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 and the rise of sovereign states like England, France, Spain, Belgium, Netherlands, etc. So essentially, the Treaty of Westphalia is happening in what is today Germany, and in those days would have been the Holy Roman Empire. This is after the Protestant Reformation wars in Europe, and I think we saw a video about that. If not, make sure to watch the video. I will provide a link. At this time, we don't see the emergence of Germany or Italy because I just said Holy Roman Empire, right? So we do see somewhat of an emergence of England as a stable state. We see France as a stable state. Spain has emerged as a European or Christian empire by now, or kingdom. And we see that other kinds of states are also emerging, which are larger than the principalities. The princely kingdoms, right? They're run by dukes, princes, that sort of thing. So sovereign here means independent of interference from other states. It's the situation that Europe just never had, right? We saw that France takes over England at some point, and basically uh, the culture of England today, some of it is French, right? They introduce the Romance languages, right? The language that has evolved out of the Roman Empire. England used to be, Celtic, and so those people had to migrate to Ireland to escape, and constantly these English now are trying to overtake Ireland, right? So we see all these skirmishes, all these wars happening within England. We know that the Danish and the Norwegians or the Vikings are attacking at one side as well. So sovereign is an interesting terminology because it means that all other states have to start respecting your borders, which is funny because they never have, right? And at this time, we also start to think about centralization of power within states. We saw that states are really fragmented. In 1215, we had the Magna Carta issue, where all the lords basically imprisoned King John because of the overtaxation, right? We talked about that. So centralization of power isn't something natural. The lords have their own soldiers. Why would they give them up? Why would they give up the soldiers to these kings, right? But ultimately, we do see the rise of state militaries, meaning that at some point the state either became very powerful because of some economic issue, condition that they were able to hire a lot of people and maybe outnumber the lords. The rise of nationalism also helped to build these militaries because suddenly people were trying to defend their territory and they felt obligated or they felt that they had to protect their borders against other people. But some kind of patriotic appeal is also there. So we'll think about these things. John Bodan is saying in his writings that centralizing power is best for the state. So he's proposing that lords should give up power to sovereigns, that kings have divine right and therefore should rule and nobody else. So John Bodan is proposing these things, and Mingst and McKibben, the authors of Essentials of International Relations, they're suggesting that this idea actually appealed to the lords, and therefore we see the centralizing of power. Or maybe it appealed to the people, and there was general pressure from the peasantry to support the king. But in reality, is this true? Is it possible that people relinquish or the lords relinquish their titles and their military might and just gave up power? So this is the moment at which students, I think, have a lot of questions because you're reading these developments are happening in Europe, but there's really no explanation in the book, or perhaps there are explanations, but they don't kind of crystallize. It's not so clear. For example, was there no internal conflict? How did the lords stop fighting against the kings, like we saw in Magna Carta? What was the reason they gave up their soldiers to form a state with centralized power? Mingst and McKibben claimed that it's Baudin's ideas, right? But who could read at that time? How many people knew about Baudin's ideas even? And why would they care? So for me, looking at this, I think some of these questions can be understood or explained by looking at economic changes in Europe, which the book doesn't do. And so here I'm listing these other authors so that you can look at some of this information yourself if you need to understand what was happening, the bigger picture changes that were happening in Europe that were economic and perhaps leading to political change. So the idea that these powerful centralized militaries arose suggests that either lords gave up military or that the kings became very rich. Sweezy and Dobb is one of the readings, or the authors rather. They wrote this paper called Transition from Feudalism to Capitalism. And it really does help us to see why things changed in Europe, why these kingdoms may have become richer, or why lords may have wanted to stop fighting and pay attention to how to make more money, right? So Sweezy and Dobb are suggesting that between 1300 and 1600, we see the demise of feudalism in Europe and the rise of capitalism. So feudalism is where you have serfs and peasants, essentially they are servants, right? They live on the land of lords and they pay a tax on production. So they can't live there for free. They pay the tax to the lords, and the lords pay a tax to the king. That's the system, and it's basically agriculture. But feudalism is a specific type of system because they're producing mainly for local use. So whatever the people are producing in the land, there's a local market or a few markets, and they go and sell those products and they make some money. And so a wide variety of things are produced. At this stage, production is basically for these local markets. For international trade, production just isn't at that level, and nobody has yet come to realize that they want to focus the production for trade. By the 1600s, however, the scene has changed. Trade is the main reason for production, no longer for local use. A few cash crops replace the wide variety of goods. So what's happening is in England, we see that the local production, some food is of course produced, some things have to be produced. But now, if you look at what crops are being produced, it's not just food, it's mainly using land to generate one or two major crops that you can trade with the world. So we see the emergence of wool. England is selling wool to the world. Lords just, by that time are interested in maximizing profits. They start to see that their land is not that good for even grazing sheep. They want more and more fertile lands. So migration to America and Caribbean becomes one way to do that. Everyone's heard of America and the Caribbean having very fertile lands. And we know that there's a lot of land in America compared to England. The weather's better. And so all this is in the thinking, basically. So we see by the 1600, corporations have been set up to establish, basically to ship people from England to the Americas and the Caribbean. These are involved in indenturing people. So what's happening is people are poor in England at this time. They want to go to America. The dream of America has been sold to these people that there's lots of land. If you go there, you can have some, but you don't have the money to actually get on my ship. And so you're going to pay for your voyage by signing a contract. You're going to work for me for 7 to 14 years typically. And in that time, basically, you are my property, and I can even sell you to somebody in America. So the agreement is basically about labor. We see a lot of people being brought to America, and many of them are children, many of them are prisoners, many of them are poor people. And so corporations get a lot of money from this, right? And they're rich enough to actually buy land titles. So the first couple of states or colonies that are established are actually the land rights belong to the companies. In Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, these colonies are established as corporate territories. So Virginia Company of London establishes what is today Virginia, Maryland, and some of these areas. And so they get the rights to uh, the colonies, basically. And they start to bring people into those colonies. Plymouth Company of London establishes Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, all those areas. British East India Company brings people to the Caribbean. So these CEOs and other executives become first governors of these colonies. Or if you look at Virginia, you see the first four governors are actually executives of the Virginia Company of London. Later governors are then appointed by the colonies, but land gained from wars are essentially retained by the colonies. So we talked about indenturing. We see that indenturing remains a practice uh, even as we move from agriculture to industrial work in the US. So, as far as agriculture, any area north of Virginia would have been growing tobacco, and any area south of Virginia would have been growing cotton. And so we see that irrespective of color, people were being brought in from Europe, Africa, everywhere, and they became bound labor until their contract, expired, right? So by the 1670s, however, we see the color line emerge. You have essentially these indentured people in this time figuring out that they're not getting any land. Their term has expired, their conditions have not improved. Many of their people who came as indentured are not alive anymore. They've died in some wars. They've been worked to death, basically. So at this time, they look at each other and, irrespective of color, realize that their situation is the same. And so they revolt against the governor of Virginia. And basically, their argument is that, all these wars are happening against the French, the Spanish, all of that. And the territory, the colony of Virginia, the governor is becoming richer, but the land is really not being distributed, right? And so this rebellion is called Bacon's Rebellion. After this point, the British military is brought in to uh, stop the rebellion. And basically, the colony decides from this point onwards, we're not going to indenture everybody. We're going to indenture only Black people because we do want to break up this camaraderie, this, whatever is developing here on a class level, because these are all the indentured people at this time, right? And so from this point on, you see generational slavery of Black people, and you see that white people, or that at this point, any Europeans brought are not to be enslaved or indentured. However, this doesn't really work out. We see that the indenturing continues because the system is profitable. And at this time, uh, you're essentially growing these cash crops like cotton and tobacco. It's a lot of money for those who are the owners of the land who are doing this. It's a good system for, it's a stable source of income. And you can only make this kind of money if you exploit people and you don't pay them anything, right? And so the owners of slaves are just taking care of the people or the slaves to the point that they, can keep them alive. By 1776, the corporations created by the British were dissolved, but both practices continued in the Free States. Indentured status continues until 1900s. Workers are needed in factories, homes, etc. But more so, you see the rise of capitalism in the US because we're still doing cash crops. And you also see the way that the English state became a stable, centralized power. Part two. Here, let's look at political conflicts in the 18th and 19th centuries. Again, the book lists a lot of wars. We kind of look at the three English civil wars, the Protestant Reformation wars. I mean, they don't necessarily list all of these, but so many wars did happen. And we see that war is a constant in the 1700s, 1800s. We saw the French-American Wars, American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, Spanish-American Wars. You see wars, basically. And this is all about expansion of territory in the American colonies, right? And also the Free State. War for colonial profits. So Treaty of Westphalia was short-lived, as I've said. We see the rise of France and we saw wars. We also read about the defeat of Napoleon due to poor planning, right? So in the 1800s, early 1800s, Napoleon comes to power in France and decides he's going to take over all the European states, especially Russia, because Russia is super rich. They have so many resources. And he's thinking, all I need is to march my soldiers, have these good outposts along the way for food and weapons, and my troops are just going to do fantastic, right? And so, in a way, he was right until he got to Russia, of course, because they burned down the food supplies and there was no place for his army to eat, rest, anything. And this basically decimated the French army that he had with him. And so when Napoleon retreated, the book explains only 10,000 people are left in the army. Of course, at this time, he had taken over Spain and other parts of Europe, all of which he had to give up. So we see a quick sort of this expansion of France within a matter of 20 years, and then a sudden stop. France went back to being the size of France. The English, Spanish, and the Dutch all saw this craziness and they supported each other against Napoleon. They became allies. And essentially, everybody at this time is interested in colonialism and making money by taking over other countries and taking their resources and using those resources and people in profitable ways. So England is competition for Spain, is competition for the Dutch, but they also start to work with each other in many ways. We see the rise of the concert of Europe. Here's a political development. Some countries look at each other and say, hey, we're actually major powers here, and we need to have a lot of understanding because we have a lot of colonies by now. And to keep the power, we need to make sure that we're not fighting each other to over those colonies. We saw what the French tried to do, right? And now we're trying to do something different. We've included the French, even though they were very unstable. And now we're going to have these regular conferences. We're going to get together and talk about power issues. So they met 30 times between 1815 and I think the 1880s. So they're meeting many times. The idea is keep the peace, develop your country, doing this colonial practices, but also industry. So we see that a lot of manufacturing is happening at this time in the different countries. They want to produce to sell these things around the world, so they don't want to fight with each other anymore. They also decide to cut up parts of Africa and divide it among themselves and basically take over those places. And of course, they did it again with each other. They're not leaving each other out. So we end up seeing cheap land, labor, metal, energy resources from Americas, Africa, and Asia ending up in Europe. And from the European side, the finished goods became exported to the different parts of the world. Also, England emerges as banker to the world, leads in industrialization. So in the 1800s, we see the rise of the British Empire. The East India Company had colonized various parts of India, Kenya, Malaysia, South Africa, parts of North Africa. The whole goal was to make a lot of money by trading with China. China actually was the one of the more, happening places in the world at that time. There was a lot of money in China, and China was also making a lot of money from these European countries by selling them silk, tea, the china that people used to drink, right? Porcelain, all of that stuff. But the British essentially became very upset because they were losing a lot of money to the Chinese. At least that's how they saw it, that they are sending a lot of silver and gold, basically, around the world to pay for these goods. But essentially, it's the merchants that were becoming rich, right? These are European merchants and also North American merchants. They were going to China and they were buying all these products and selling them within Europe and America and making lots of money. However, the British thought it would be better if the Chinese were buying from them. And they couldn't find anything other than local things in Asia that the Chinese wanted. So they took over India, started growing tea, started growing rice, started growing things that the Chinese economy, or the wanted from the British, right? They started to grow spices. They started to sell those spices. So everything revolved around China. And then they figured out that basically the best product was opium. If you grew opium, you could sell that. People became addicted to it. And really, there was a lot of money to be made. And so they ended up actually having wars with China over opium because the Chinese did not want the British to sell them opium. You also see in South America, Britain established banks. They facilitate commerce. They become involved in Latin America. In the Caribbean, it colonized many island states. So we see that England has emerged as this powerful economic and military power, essentially, right? Italy and Germany were looking at what was happening, and they formed strong nations. And they rapidly militarized because they realized that, look, around us, we have all these rich neighbors. We have France, Spain, England. They make tons of money from colonialism. We could actually take over these nations. We need to develop our military. So in World War One and Two, we see that, right? We see that these countries are trying to take over other countries in Europe. This is how they're going to control the European colonies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America as well, right? So there's all these economic reasons for what happened in World War One and World War Two. It's not just that Italy and Germany became, nationalist and they decided that they're going to take over these countries for fun. There were economic goals. And so we see that during Nazi Germany, when these wars have started, Africa goes, many countries become colonized by the Germans for a few years. In the 1800s, we also see very large labor movements happening. We see with industrialization that more labor exploitation is happening, right? Workers are actually subjected to terrible working conditions. Many work 18 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. And so Karl Marx actually writes Das Kapital in German, which is, the name for capital, the book. He's actually writing about these scenarios in Europe in the 1800s. Workers are actually getting tired of being, working like this, especially in these difficult industries like steel manufacturing, coal production. And they are demanding better pay and better hours. They're also easily replaced by cheaper labor. So all of this is becoming a source of conflict within states. We see a lot of labor movements. Workers are getting tired of being exploited. They're forming, they're having strikes, they're organizing. And eventually, by the 1900s, they actually become part of the liberal democracies. Workers' parties are now represented in government. So we see a lot of industrialists becoming very upset, and by the 1930s, in Spain, France, Germany, and England, we see the industrial powers becoming frustrated by worker parties. And a certain strain of politics emerges, which is very anti worker, labeling workers as communists, as foreigners, as agitators, and blaming them for the destruction, the rise of World War One, and all the deaths that happened, and for the poverty that is emerging in Europe after World War One. And we see that these parties actually, these right-wing, very, very controversial parties, coming to power in all of these countries, with the exception of England. And they actually help each other. So in Germany, we see Hitler comes to power by pure accident. He's sort of a minor party that after after their president dies or chancellor, Hitler's personality is kind of interesting. He manages to become the successor, and he dissolves the parliament, this new liberal democracy that had emerged in Germany, where all these political parties, such as the workers' parties, but also the Christian parties and the democratic parties and all kinds of parties were represented. And suddenly all parties were dissolved and a state of emergency was declared, and making Hitler the uh, undisputed person in charge, right? And Hitler's main argument was to bring back the royals, that essentially we need to dissolve liberal democracy. That's the problem. It's given too much attention to what labor wants. And he wants to create a kingdom Go back to the king. The king was, the best type of rule. Okay. In Italy, France, and Spain, not necessarily want to return to kings, but Spain, of course, does want to return to kings. But Italy and France, I mean, they are really also upset by the poverty, the strikes, and they want to have a more stable industrialist policy. So workers' parties were ousted, many were murdered, um, and so the first victims of Hitler probably are the workers before anything else. So these are some of the developments we see in Europe. The Mingst and McKibben talk about these. So focus on these. In the next lectures, we'll talk about what happened after World War II.